So welcome everybody. I hope you had a nice tea. Let us begin because you're running behind time. So this is, of course, the Restoring Flora, Fauna and Fungi. This is our session. Like some other sessions, I think some of us tend to believe that this is the most important session, but I think they're all related in some way or the others, of course. And that's how we have structured it. And some of the objectives of the session that we want to have outcomes, because that's what we want from this Nilgiri Scapes. This panel invites critical reflection on the future of ecological restoration in the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve, focusing on the recovery and reconnection of flora, fauna, and fungi across this landscape. What will it take to substantially expand the restoration zone? Can large areas of the buffer zone be transitioned into actively managed spaces for rewilding? How can restoration planning extend beyond the protected areas to include urban patches, unused plantation portions as corridors, and cultural landscapes? What models of public-private partnerships might enable civil society organizations, collectives, and government to collaboratively restore degraded public lands? Can private estate owners be persuaded to set aside unproductive or fallow lands for rewilding? What role might philanthropic acquisition of unviable plantations play in biodiversity recovery? And then, how can Indigenous peoples be recognized not just as stakeholders, but as partners and traditional managers in restoration efforts? We saw a bit of that earlier. What forms of community reserves might emerge through their leadership and traditional ecological knowledge? As all of us are aware, there would have been no Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve if our Indigenous people had not managed it the way they did for millennia, right? There would have been nothing, right? So let's give them a hand, because it is these people who have maintained at different portions of right across the NBR that this was selected to be the very first biosphere reserve in all of India. And we must acknowledge their management practices and also learn to incorporate the traditional ecological knowledge, like using fire practices. Some of those firing rituals performed by the Todas to herald the onset of winter have now been proscribed. We need to restore those things, because that is critical to management of our grasslands. And as many of our ecologists will tell us, those fire regimes are very important. And this has been performed by the Todas ritually, like they did everything. The Todas, their ecosystem management practices, they ritualize them. So once you ritualize them, and the priest has to initiate it and things like that, then it became, it had a kind of sanctity to it. So they did that to herald the onset of winter. And they used fire sticks. They couldn't just light a fire, fire like that. They had to use fire sticks of Litsia whiteana to make fire by friction. So that's how they set fire. It wasn't just in a perfunctory way, but it was a way of direct ecosystem management. So today, Todas are only allowed to perform indirect methods of ecosystem management. Like they go up some of the hilltops. In April, they go up to this hilltop known as Poj in the Wenlock Downs. And they pray to the hill and the Paikala river deity, which is known as the Kolikeen in Toda, for ecological and general well-being. They go to the hills. The DFO showed the Conte, the Devabetta hill there. They go up there. All the hamlets from the Kunda area go up there every year. And they pray to all the sacred deities who are living in the mountains, in the rivers, etc., for ecological well-being. That is for a good, bountiful monsoon. And the other form of indirect ecological management that they still practice is that all the Toda 15 clans, during all the different seasons of the year, they pour salt water for their buffaloes. As all of you know, in the Nilgiris, free salt is usually not available in the Nilgiris. So the Todas again solved this problem by ritualizing it. If you hear about the old stories about the god Quatain and other people going, they would take a journey right down the southwestern slopes of the Nilgiris, beyond Tudiki beyond what is Manargad site in what is Kerala now, just for salt. It was it was the most precious commodity was salt here. And so they ritualize it. So if you don't do the saltwater ceremony for the buffaloes in winter, there'll be lack of frost. And if there's lack of frost, the whole ecology goes awry. Similarly, if you don't do it in the pre-monsoon session, the monsoon will fail. And only if you have a good bountiful monsoon will you have pasture for the buffaloes. There'll be milk, there'll be honey, and there'll be, there'll be water in the streams for their rituals and everything. So these are still allowed, but the direct method of ecosystem management has to be revived. I've been talking about this now for 30 years, but it hasn't happened. And they should be allowed to use their firing rituals with all the sanctity that it deserves. Okay, so coming back to this, what species and ecosystem should be prioritized? Grasslands, wetlands, shola forests, fungal and moss networks. How might restoration efforts revive the habitats of endangered and endemic species like the Nilgiri Tahr, the Nilgiri Pipit, and the migratory woodcock? What infrastructure is needed to support ecological connectivity, including overland and subterranean migratory routes? How can native landscaping contribute to ecological recovery in public and private spaces? Can restoration planning be made climate responsive, anticipating altitudinal shifts in flora and fauna? Very important. The panel aims to address these questions through cross-sectoral insights and interdisciplinary dialogue, laying the foundation for a collective vision of biodiversity recovery in NBR. Not only the panelists, but we would like the audience also to contribute into this. If you look at old botanical books, not very old actually, in the early parts of the 20th century, so less than 100 years back, if you look for some species like impatiens, which I look for, and several impatient species, I'm quite surprised to find that those books like Faison and all mention that, you can find it on Churchill, I'm just talking about, Churchill is talking about exactly what he showed. And now there's not a chance, there's not a single plant there. And similarly, shola species around Ooty, when Henry Nolte came to do a biography of Robert White, the great botanist, rather a surgeon turned botanist. And, the British time, they were very smart because so if Robert White came as a surgeon, they said, I think you'll be better placed doing, collecting plants. So, you give up this and do this. And so, he discovered about 150 species of plants or more than that. At least there are about 60, 70 are named for him, stuff like that. And so Nolte found that it mentions there and that, when although he used to come to Nilgiris once in a way, he used to cover many parts of the Western Ghats, including the NBR area. And apparently he used to come to Nilgiris. There's a house in just on the outskirts. If you go up to Dodabetta down called Bellevue, you might see it on the road. You can see that board there, Bellevue. That bungalow is intact. And, one of the most striking ground orchids in the Nilgiris is known as Disperus nilgirens. I call it as a Donald Duck orchid. And now you have to go all the way to either beyond, Lakadi area, or you have to go to Seaspara to see it, to see that in that condition now flowering. And actually, Robert White discovered it right in the ravine next to his house in Ooty. So it's just indicative of how things have changed and how we have altered everything, in there. So Ian, I'll start with you. What I want to know is that, based in your restoration projects in the Palnis and in Sri Lankan highlands, how have you approached rebuilding the subterranean networks, especially the soil, microbial and fungal? Because we haven't spoken much about that yet, and it's critical for restoration, that are so crucial for native grass, associated shrubs, herbs, and stunted tree recruitment. And you can list out what we can use here. You also mentioned about the Pinus caribae plantations. Incidentally, I've seen that in its native habitat in Yucatan, when it's beautiful there in its native habitat. And and what you've used in, you showed from Sinaraja. So, but how can the same, process be applied to, for our extant wattle, pinus, and eucalyptus plantation in NBR to restore grassland in your, not, as a forest as you did there. So how can that same model, similar model be adapted here for our grassland restoration, what you use for the pinus, you showed that in Sinaraja? And how can the extensive use of tree transplants has been done in Sri Lanka? I've noticed in your papers, you talk about using transplanted trees, of young trees as nurse trees in your papers. It's very interesting because that concept can be incorporated in our restoration efforts here. I want you to just mention that briefly. And you also mentioned in Knuckles Conservation Forest in one of your papers, the creation of large tree islands of native tree species within grasslands to link lower montane forests there. rather than connecting them with grassland, you connect them with, tree cover.
Okay, so one of your questions was like the methods of from Sinaraja, how you might do that in the grasslands.
Yeah.
I mean, again, those site-specific species, it's already been mentioned here, right? Looking at the ecological succession part of it. I mean, I don't know. I think most of you guys others would have a better sense of that. The issue of fire is really interesting. In the montane grasslands in the Sri Lankan context, I know they don't use fire. They use, the laborious sort of digging out. They have some of the same invasives that you guys have here. So I'm not sure. I think the approaches for Sinaraja would really work more in a forest ecosystem rather than in a grassland, right? Like that. The knuckles example that you're talking about comes from Professor Gunatilaka's study. And in that book, they have a nice chapter. So the knuckles is another region in Sri Lanka, elevated sort of, it's a sky island in a sense. It's separated and actually it has a lot of closer similarities to the Western Ghats, especially the KMTR area, that area. And I think they are trying there they've got mid-elevation grasslands and they've got forest patches there. So they are working with a variety of different sort of strategies. I'm not an expert on those myself. I've spent most of my time in the Sinaraja area.
Thank you, Ian. I'll come to you, Robin. In one of your recent papers that you mentioned, you say that unlike many forest species that can take advantage of other wooded land cover types, the grassland or the open natural ecosystem bird species in this region have been unable to take advantage of alternate habitats, right? I'm quoting your words. However, of the 9 species of grassland birds covered in your study, where you indicate a 90% decrease, it appears to me, as a layman resident, that the selection of representative species may not be perfectly appropriate, excluding the Nilgiri Pipit. So, as an illustrative example, 6 of your 9 grassland species that you have studied can actually be seen in my home garden, right? Quite commonly. That's one question. The second is why the larks and the pipits are truer illustrative species. It is noteworthy that they can also be spotted in open woodlands, even Kikuyu areas. We have seen them, provided some pristine grasslands are nearby. If you have no pristine grasslands nearby, you won't see these pipits. But if you have them nearby, even in slightly altered areas, even Kikuyu, we have seen these birds. So can you suggest, because you see, by the time you finish the grassland restoration, your pipits may be critically endangered, right? So we can't really wait for that. So can you suggest some kind of microhabitat in, changes, some perching sites or some kind of alterations that we can at least preserve the habitat for these, pipits and all that? And would it not be also important to include true wetland birds like, the woodcock and the snipes and all, which are actually true, and we don't see, seeing a woodcock is a very, very rare sighting. And I think they're very, though they're migratory, and it's also very critical to include some of these rather than some of the more common birds that you have mentioned there. You also mentioned that in this report that you could not report any association between species occurrence and climate changes due to lack of data. However, many residents here will tell you that birds like the koel can now be seen in Ooty and in Kunur, and you can hear them. Ring parakeets can be seen in these townships and all that. And finally, in this paper that you mentioned and actually showed the graph, the water bodies in the Nilgiris cover just 20 square kilometers. Many of our reservoirs itself cover an area more than that. So I just want your take on some of these questions. If you can remember some, you answer whichever you remember, maybe. Or you can take the convenient ones also, no problem, because we're running out of time.
Editor did not choose you as a reviewer. But so the easier one to go to is the pipit, what to do, extinction and things like that. So that's fairly straightforward. I think pushing back the invasion front, that's the only real thing to do, because that kind of keeps more intact habitat.
Right.
You don't wait for the invasion to move in and things like that. So that's one. The other one was about this paper, which I did not talk about the decline of birds associated with the mapping part. I only spoke about the mapping part because the decline of birds was estimated with a very complicated method, which is called field abundance, museum abundance. Essentially, you're trying to find how many birds were there that were collected in the past and is there in museums. And then you're trying to kind of resurvey those places with current surveys. And then you're trying to make the story. So I think that part has to be taken with a pinch of salt.
Yeah, those 9 birds which you mentioned and 6 are in my garden. You have the the hoopoe, and you have the pied bush chat, and you have all those as grass birds. Anyway, so
very quickly, I think that what it shows is that it would have been more abundant earlier than what you're finding now. So they are probably there even now, but the extent and the numbers would have been greater earlier. Finally, about the idea of how people know that climate is changing and species are changing, the real problem is about baseline data. So if we had data about birds in 1800s, systematic surveys, 1900s, or even early 2000s, it would have been really easy to do some of these comparisons, but we don't have that.
Yeah.
Even for climate, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we are not able to make quantitative assessments.
So I'm coming to Atul. You've worked on your nitrogen fixation and all. So I'll just come in areas bordering sholas that now host wattle plantations, or even under tea that is left unpruned as an invasion frontier. One can often find numerous shola species regenerating naturally. Okay, it's a very important question. This area would have been a grassland in the past. Undertaking ecological restoration in such areas poses a dilemma. Does one remove hundreds of young shola plants to plant it with grassland species, that it was a grassland earlier? Or would it be advisable to undertake additional planting of saplings, thus converting it into an extension of the contiguous shola? You see, it's a very critical question that we are facing. I think anybody who's doing ecology restoration here knows. You understand what I'm saying? So you are doing, so it's a dilemma. So you have invasive species or even tea or wattle, etc. It would have been a grassland. You're doing restoration, but there are hundreds and thousands of shola saplings which are coming up. The shola is contiguous. Do you remove the shola species and convert it to grassland, or do you make it into an extension of the shola there? So it's a very important question.
Thanks. Yeah, this is definitely a critical question. But if I go with my study and findings, what I can see is that if there is temperature is well above freezing temperature, 0 degrees, or if the occurrence of frost is less, then definitely there is a scope for C3 plants. That's shola or even C3 grasses, right? So even if you remove the saplings and try to, even if you try remove the shola tree seedlings or saplings and try to restore grassland, if the frost is not occurring there and if there is no fire, then probably again shola tree seedlings will come up. So probably it's better to let them grow. That would be my answer.
Yeah, I think that's the right answer also. Good. I mean, that's the one I expected to hear. Let's put it that way. So, Mahesh, so there is a very interesting phenomenon that we are noticing in the western Upper Nilgiris Plateau. It's a very critical thing which people may not be aware of. Perhaps due to changing climatic conditions, Daphne-phylum nilgirens, and I think in one of your thing you could see them there, right? You could see them coming up in that exotic plantation. Due to climatic conditions, perhaps, Daphne-phylum nilgirens is first moving into the ecotone and then entering the adjacent grassland. Other edge and a few shola species are then found under its shade. Entire stretches of what the Todas call this as kafaj are now forming new frontiers for shola expansion. Please do share your thoughts on that, because contrary to what we expect, we are finding in the western areas where there's frost, there's everything, you find this Daphne-phylum is spreading thousands. I can show you pictures where it's spreading, and I don't see any study which has been done on this. And a lot of other species are also coming under that. So I'd like your opinion on this.
Well, I must say, I don't know about the species or anything that I will be saying this hypothetical, but presumably it's able to do one of two things. Well, it's not that it is able to tolerate frost because then it should have happened in the past. The only thing I can think about is some kind of change in the climate, or in terms of water regimes, something that's allowing the species to spread.
Yeah.
But I really don't. I haven't studied the species, so I really
Yeah, it's an important observation. I can show you pictures and say, and if anybody who's been trudging, 1 minute, Johnny, don't come too close to me. Yeah, so before I hand it over to the audience, I have 2 points because it's a restoration workshop, restoration session. And it's very important to remember that in the NBR, if we're going to have outcomes, according to what I know, the restoration zone in the NBR forms just 30 square kilometers of the 5,600 square kilometers. The buffer of forestry zone extends over 2,290 square kilometers. While we are unaware of the current state of this minuscule restoration zone area, it is obvious that in order to rejuvenate the NBR, we need to shift large tracts of this forestry zone into a restoration zone. Unless we do this, we cannot move forward, right? You saw the maps earlier, so you have all the zones, but the restoration zone is too small. We have to create a larger mass of area if we're going to progress and have outcomes for the rejuvenation of the NBR. The second point I want to make for people who don't know, I think most people will know that this is the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, and Goal 5, because this is one of the most important things for the United Nations Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. And Goal 5 of that is landscapes and forest lands to restore and maintain 350 million hectares by 2030, right? Recently, the Forest Secretary of Tamil Nadu had come to my center, and she mentioned that the state government of Tamil Nadu has a policy to increase their forest cover, which includes grasslands and everything, and native cover, it means no exotics, from 23% to 33%. So, so that's the target, is what she mentioned. They have this there. I think the DFO will know about it. And so, if we have to have 350 million hectares restored worldwide by 2030, what role are we going to play? So then I can throw it open to you. I was basically trying to mention that we can start with the wetlands. So many years back, when we wanted to identify this thatch grass that the toadas use, you are aware of that. We had to find flowering specimens. Although my toda friends from half a kilometer could say this is aful, this is narioff, this is tirzoi, and all the grass they could for half a kilometer, no phenology, whatever, they didn't have to have flowering cycles and all. We had to collect it, send it to Professor Cope in Kew Gardens for identification. And it came that he identified as Aerochrysis rangacharya. That's how we identified it, because by the anthropologists had put it as as an anthropogon earlier, as you know, Polypticus. And so when we studied these wetlands around Korakunda in that time, this is about 25 years back almost, and we found that the wetlands which had caught fire due to some reason, maybe a natural reason or whatever, those wetlands had these critical species like Aerochrysis and like that. Whereas the wetlands which hadn't caught fire had about 80 species of biodiversity. So a layperson will say, wonderful biodiversity, because this wetland has only 10 species and that has 80 species. But actually those were the wrong species, the forbs and all, which came back. So maybe we can, because this Aerochrysis rangacharya is critically endangered and todas depend on it completely for their thatching. It's not found anywhere else outside that part of the Nilgiris. So maybe we can start, doing it on the wetlands, because that won't damage anything else there. So maybe you can answer the rest of it.
Most of the native species typically, because when the grasses are all fire tolerant, and even if you look at most of the forbs, they have these underground storage organs, which is indicative of fire and frost tolerance. So I don't think the fire will necessarily kill the natives. We don't know if any invasives are going to come, but I don't know that even those high elevation grasslands, besides the 3 nitrogen fixer, if there are any other major problems. But like you said, maybe these are small scale experiments that one can do before, which has to be done rather than fire the whole place because we don't know what the outcome will be. There's a need for experiments. That's what I was also trying to say.
think that the answer lies in the ancient adaptation is more to climate. I think what Jobin's study showed was that vegetation structure, wherever the structure was there, birds were moving there as long as the climatic space extends there. So you can't do anything about climate. You can't. I mean, those are other larger factors. So in terms of restoration, I don't think you can do anything about climate directly, but you can go with the understanding that within the climate boundary, wherever you restore, these birds will come. About the conservation and science action, yeah, I think that this, without making a bigger point of it, this does need to go hand in hand. And there's never a point, if somebody asks, when will you stop doing research on something? That's the wrong question. Because the goalposts change. As you find something, then there is something else to figure out. The first question was, how much area do we have as invaded in the Nilgiris? So we found that out. Then that is actionable. But the next question is, which are the species that are mixed? And then we can work on finding that, or how do you detect young invasion? And probably one of the questions that are still not answered is, what is the area of exotic grassland? Because all the maps that we have is of grassland is actually including native grassland and the invasive species that we were talking about. So I think there's an opportunity for research and action to go hand in hand. And the closer that they go together, I think that the solutions are more practical, just like the fire example that was stated.